So the first step I need to complete is to position the chromatography paper so it's 152 millimeters tall and 19 millimeters wide, meaning I'm going to have it vertical. So here's my chromatography paper here. I'm going to have it vertically, and then I'm going to do some measurements with it. So I'm going to make sure everything's out of the way, and I'm also going to make sure that there's nothing on my lab bench, okay? So I'm going to place it right here. And one special note, guys, you really do not want to be handling the paper too much. You want to just, as you notice, I'm just touching the sides of it, okay? Because otherwise you could be putting oils on the paper, okay? The next step says, using a ruler and a pencil, draw a faint line 15 millimeters from the bottom of the paper across the width of the strip, okay? I'm using my ruler, 15 millimeters. Okay, so that would be 1.5 centimeters from the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to draw my line in pencil, and then I'm going to draw a line across. So if I'm being careful with my paper, you can see the line right there. Okay. So I'm going to put this back down. Then it says, measure 9.5 millimeters from the edge and place a dot. This is the starting point. So along this line, I'm going to put a dot, and it's going to be 9.5 millimeters. So again, notice as I'm doing this, I'm trying to not be touching the paper as much as possible. So a little bit less than, so it's going to be 9 millimeters, 9.5, so right in between 0.9 and 1 centimeter, okay? I'm going to put a dot, okay? So I've got my dot there. That's where I'm going to actually be marking it with my die, my chromatography paper. Next it says, using the same ruler, measure 20 millimeters from the top of the strip and fold across the width of the strip. This will allow the strip to hang from the lip of the flask. So I'm going to measure 20 millimeters, which is just 2 centimeters. Minimize the amount you're touching your chromatography paper. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it, because that's what's going to hang over the lip of my flask. So it'll look like that, okay? Now my paper's ready to go. Now it says obtain the dye mixture. So the dye mixture will be given to you. It's gonna be stored in this flask right here. So you'll obtain a little bit of it in a beaker, in a little beaker. You need very little of it because you're just gonna spot using a toothpick. So just grab a little bit in a beaker. Using a clean toothpick, spot the chromatography strip by placing a toothpick into the dye mixture solution and then touching the tip of the toothpick gently onto the designated pencil dot. Allow the sample to dry. Repeat the procedure 2 to 3 times. Note, this step is necessary to increase the concentration of the sample, but you are not supposed to allow the size of the spot to increase. So you need to let it dry in between spottings. So I'm going to take my toothpick, okay, I'm going to put it into my dye solution, and I'm just going to place it very carefully onto the dot that I drew in the center of my chromatography paper. Remember, try not to be touching it too much. Okay, spot it, and then you'll release. Okay, so I just put a little tiny, you can barely even see it. Put a little spot there, okay? And then I'm going to wait, I'm going to allow it to dry. Okay, and then once I feel like it's ready, I'm going to spot it again. Make sure not to let the dot get too big, because that means you're going to allow the dye to be spreading too much. Okay, so there we go. Just to be careful, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this, allow this to dry, and do my next step, and then I'm going to spot it maybe 1 or 2 more times. Okay, so the next step, while allowing the sample to dry, obtain a 250 ml Erlenmeyer flask, which I have right here, and watch glass, which I have right here. That's going to go on the top of the Erlenmeyer flask. Okay. Pour 20 mils of isopropyl alcohol solution into the flask. Cover the flask with the watch glass. So I'm going to pour 20 mils of isopropyl alcohol. That'll be given to you. And I'm going to pour it into my flask. Okay. And based on what we've learned already, I need to cover it with the watch glass because isopropyl alcohol, which has dipole-dipole interactions, those are fairly weak. And so as a result, isopropyl alcohol, if you leave it out, it will quickly become a gas. And so what this watch glass allows us to do, while there will be isopropyl alcohol molecules becoming a gas, they're not going to escape. So at a certain point, they'll stop becoming a gas and they'll reach equilibrium where the rate at which they become a gas equals the rate at which they become a liquid again. So you're going to minimize the loss of isopropyl alcohol. If you left it open, they would just escape and it would never reach equilibrium because no isopropyl alcohol gas molecules will become a liquid again. Okay. I'm going to spot my chromatography paper one more time. You got to be patient or else it'll actually spread. Once the chromatography paper is dry, remove the watch glass from the top of the flask. Carefully hang the chromatography strip into the flask with the sample end down. This is important. Do not get any solvent on the upper portion of the strip because that's going to mess up the movement of your solvent through the chromatography paper. The sample spots must remain above the level of the solvent, right? So here I've got my spot, okay? That spot cannot go below the solvent, right? Because what the whole point of this is that the solvent, the isopropyl alcohol, is going to move through the chromatography paper and separate out your dyes based on their polarities. If the solvent level is too high, the sample will dilute into the solvent, right? So if you actually allow the isopropyl alcohol to be above the level of the dye, then what's going to happen is this dye will then go into solution. It's not going to move up the way it should. So just make sure that the level is correct, okay? So I'm going to put this in, and then I'm going to allow it to run. So I'm going to put it into my flask, make sure that it doesn't actually touch any part of it. And what's really cool is that the lip of it is the perfect height based on the measurements they gave you. Okay, so I'm going to leave that and I'm going to allow that to run. So what's happening is the isopropyl alcohol is actually moving up the chromatography paper and it will move along, it will grab the dye molecules and cause the dye molecules to separate out based on different polarities. So you can see it moving up, okay? Then it says carefully place the watch glass back on top of the flask, allow the chromatogram to develop. So I'm going to put my lid back on just to prevent the isopropyl alcohol from getting lost, okay? And this is going to run. Notice it's running pretty slowly. When the chromatography solvent is within 1 to 2 centimeters of the fold in the chromatography strip, stop the run by removing the strip from the flask. With a pencil, lightly draw a line to mark the distance the solvent traveled. This is called the solvent front. Make sure to note that because what will happen is the paper will dry and then you won't know where the solvent ended up. Measure the distance from the pencil line at the bottom of the strip to the solvent front. Record this distance in millimeters in an appropriate data table. With a pencil, trace the shape of each dye band or spot to mark its location on the chromatography strip. This should be done immediately because the color and brightness of some spots may fade over time. Measure and record the distance in millimeters that each dye band or spot traveled. Measure from the line at the bottom of the paper to the center of each band or spot. So if it's not an exact spot, then you're going to go to the center of the band.